Welcome back to Crimson Mask. In this special episode, we examine 9 criminal cases, each committed by a man whose choices left behind grief, outrage, and unanswered questions. From small-town tragedies to crimes that made national headlines, these are not just statistics. They are lives interrupted, families torn apart, and communities forced to reckon with the unimaginable. 9 men, 9 stories, 1 state. This is Alabama. This is Crimson Mask. Thomas Edwin Blandon Jr. was born in the early 1930s and raised in Birmingham, Alabama. A product of the Jim Crow, South Blandon grew up steeped in segregationist beliefs and would eventually become a member of the Ku Klux Klan. Outwardly, he worked a blue-collar job and led a relatively unremarkable life. But behind closed doors, he harbored deep racial hatred. By the time he reached his 30s, he was already immersed in the violent underground of white supremacist ideology. The early 60s were a time of massive racial upheaval in the South. Birmingham, known as one of the most segregated cities in America, was at the heart of the civil rights struggle. Civil rights leaders organized protests, boycotts, and marches often met with brutal police force. Blandon, like many others in the Klan, viewed the rising tide of integration and equality as a personal threat to his way of life. For men like him, the fear of change became a justification for violence. On the morning of September 15, 1963, a powerful explosion tore through the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. The church had served as a hub for civil rights meetings and youth activities. The bomb killed 4 young black girls, 11-year-old Denise McNair, and 3 14-year-olds, Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, and Carol Robertson. Over 20 others were injured. The blast occurred just before Sunday services, shaking the city to its core. For decades, the case remained unsolved, with suspicions pointing toward Klan involvement, but no one was held accountable. Although the FBI gathered evidence implicating Blandon and others shortly after the bombing, Director J. Edgar Hoover suppressed the findings, refusing to share them with prosecutors. The case went cold. It wasn't until the 1990s that state and federal authorities reopened the investigation. In May of 2001, nearly 38 years after the bombing, Thomas Blandon was convicted on 4 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms. During sentencing, Blandon offered no remorse, stating only, "The good Lord will settle it on Judgment Day." Blandon's actions were driven by a toxic mix of racial hatred, fear, and indoctrination. He wasn't mentally ill or disconnected from reality. He knew what he was doing. The bombing wasn't random. It was calculated terrorism aimed at intimidating a community fighting for basic human rights. Blandon believed in white supremacy and was willing to kill innocent children to uphold it. He was not a lone wolf, but part of a broader system of hate that enabled violence in the name of preserving segregation. Thomas Blandon lived most of his life free while the families of Denise, Addie Mae, Cynthia, and Carol endured decades of grief. His eventual conviction brought long overdue justice, but it could never undo the pain of what happened that Sunday morning in 1963. Blandon died in prison in 2020. The story of the church bombing stands as a brutal reminder of how hate, when left unchecked, can lead to unthinkable tragedy. But it also reminds us that justice, even when delayed, is still worth pursuing. Henry Francis Hayes was 26 years old in the spring of 1981. Born and raised in Alabama, he was the son of Benny Jack Hayes, one of the highest-ranking officials in the Ku Klux Klan. Henry grew up in a home filled with violence and hate. His father was known to beat his sons and instill in them a deep resentment toward anyone outside their racial circle. From an early age, Henry was exposed to the Klan's ideology, and it shaped the man he became: angry, intolerant, and ultimately dangerous. On the surface, he was quiet and unremarkable, working odd jobs and blending into the fabric of Mobile. But behind closed doors, he was deeply entangled in the white supremacist movement. The trigger for what happened next was political and personal. In early 1981, the trial of a black man accused of killing a white police officer ended in a hung jury. That outcome outraged Klan members who believed justice had failed because some jurors were black. During a heated meeting, Benny Jack Hayes reportedly declared, "If a black man can get away with killing a white man, we ought to be able to get away with killing a black man." That statement would set off a deadly chain of events. On the night of March 20th, Henry Hayes and fellow Klan member James Tiger Knowles set out to commit a symbolic act of terror. They drove around Mobile, Alabama, looking for a black man to kill. Eventually, they spotted 19-year-old Michael Donald walking home after running a simple errand for his sister. Donald was a trade school student and part-time worker at a local newspaper. He had no criminal record, no enemies. He was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Hayes and Knowles forced Michael into their car, drove him to a secluded area, and brutally attacked him. They beat him with tree branches, slashed his throat, and strangled him with a rope. They then drove his lifeless body back into town and hung him from a tree across the street from his home, an unmistakable symbol of a lynching. Local police first claimed the killing was drug-related, but Michael's mother, Beulah May Donnell, knew better. Her persistence and public outcry drew attention from civil rights leaders and the national media. Eventually, the FBI took over the investigation. Knowles confessed and turned state's witness, receiving life in prison. Henry Hayes was arrested and charged with capital murder. At trial, Knowles described the crime in detail, leaving little doubt about Hayes's role. In 1984, Hayes was convicted and sentenced to death. His father, Benny Jack Hayes, was also charged but died before facing trial. In the years that followed, Beulah May Donnell, with help from the Southern Poverty Law Center, filed a civil lawsuit against the United Klans of America. The verdict was historic, a $7 million judgment that bankrupted the Klan and led to the seizure of its national headquarters. In the final days before his execution, Henry Hayes claimed innocence. But in a private conversation with Reverend Bob Smith, president of Mobile's NAACP chapter, Hayes broke down and confessed in detail. On June 6, 1997, Hayes was executed in Alabama's electric chair nicknamed Yellow Mama. He was the first white man in Alabama executed for killing a black person in over 80 years. The case left scars, but it also changed history. It dismantled one of the most notorious hate groups in the country and set a precedent for using civil courts to fight racial terrorism. In his last moments, Hayes turned to the victim's brother and mouthed, "I love you." But no gesture could erase what had been done. Michael Donnell's death was senseless, brutal, and unforgettable. And in the end, the very act meant to display power marked the downfall of hate itself. Lam Long was 38 years old when he committed a crime that stunned the Gulf Coast and drew national attention. On the morning of January 7, 2008, he drove his van to the top of the Dauphin Island Bridge in Alabama and threw 4 children into the Mississippi Sound 80 feet below. The victims were his own children, Ryan, age 3, Hannah, age 2, Lindsay, age 1, and Danny, just 4 months old. Luong was a Vietnamese refugee who came to the United States as a teenager. His early life was marked by rejection, shunned for being the son of a black American soldier and a Vietnamese mother. In Alabama, he lived with his common-law wife, Q Phan, and their extended family in Bayou La Batre. Though described by relatives as once hardworking and affectionate, Luong had spiraled into crack cocaine addiction, unemployment, and erratic behavior. He often disappeared for days, borrowed money, and maintained a relationship with another woman. On that January morning, Luong placed the children in the van and told the family he was going for a drive. 3 of the children were dressed in pajamas without coats or shoes. Only Ryan, the oldest, was properly dressed. By nightfall, Luong returned without them and claimed he had left them with a woman named Kim. The family panicked. They searched door to door, believing his story, but it was a lie. Luong later confessed to police, saying he had killed the children as an act of revenge against their mother. He laughed when telling Kyo Phan that no one would ever find them. The bodies were recovered one by one over 2 weeks. Danny was found first by a duck hunter near Port Oak Pines. Ryan was discovered 3 days later near Bayou La Fourche. Lindsay's body surfaced near Jose Bay, and Hannah was found in Venice, Louisiana, nearly 100 miles from the bridge. At trial, Luong presented no defense and did not testify. Witnesses, including his wife's sister-in-law and mother-in-law, wept as they described his descent into addiction and instability. Prosecutors said the children were alive when they hit the water. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before convicting him of capital murder. In March 2009, Luong pleaded guilty and asked to be put to death. "I no longer want to live, but I don't know how to die," he wrote in a letter. Judge Charles Graddick accepted the plea, but reminded Luong that Alabama law required a full trial. The jury later recommended the death penalty, and Graddick sentenced him accordingly. He ordered that Luong be shown photographs of the children each day he remains on death row. The case drew intense media coverage. Hundreds of volunteers joined the search. 600 people attended the children's memorial service. Cards, gifts, and handmade tributes arrived from across the country. But the saturation of publicity raised legal concerns. In 2013, an appeals court overturned the conviction, citing procedural errors and the failure to move the trial out of Mobile County. Luong's defense team argued that he had been pressured into confessing, that he was under emotional duress, and that he had initially claimed the children were taken by strangers. But the evidence in his own words told a different story. Lam Luong's crime left a community grieving and a nation asking how a father could do the unthinkable. As one judge put it, "I've never seen anything like this before." Some tragedies leave behind no answers, only silence and the sound of waves beneath a bridge. Michael Kenneth McClendon was 28 years old when he carried out the deadliest mass shooting by a single gunman in Alabama's history. On March 10, 2009, he killed 10 people across 2 counties before taking his own life. The rampage devastated the small town of Sampson, where McClendon had grown up and where most of his victims lived. McClendon's life was marked by instability. He struggled to hold down jobs and failed out of the police academy after just 1 week, and had recently quit his position at a sausage plant where he had been considered a team leader. Years earlier, he had been forced to resign from Reliable Metals, the very place where his rampage would end. Investigators found lists in his home names of co-workers, supervisors, and even 9 local attorneys. These were people he believed had wronged him. One note referenced a dispute over a family Bible. Another detailed grievances as petty as being asked to clean a meat grinder or being criticized for how he cut pork chops. The attack began in Kinston, Alabama, where McClendon shot his mother, Lisa White McClendon, and set their house on fire. He then drove to Sampson and murdered several relatives, his Uncle James White, cousin Tracy Wise, her 15-year-old son Dean, and his grandmother, Virginia White. He also killed a neighbor, Andrea Myers, and her 18-month-old daughter, Corinne. Andrea's husband, Deputy Josh Myers, was among the officers sent to pursue McClendon, unaware that his wife and child were among the victims. Their 4-month-old daughter, Ella, was wounded but survived. McClendon continued his rampage, shooting a pedestrian, James Starling, and killing Sonia Smith at a local convenience store. He then fired at random motorists, killing Bruce Malloy, a welder driving along Highway 52. As he drove toward Geneva, he fired at vehicles, stores, and police officers. Geneva Police Chief Frankie Lindsay was shot in the shoulder. Several others were injured by flying glass. The final confrontation occurred at Reliable Metals, where McClendon had once worked. Armed with 2 assault rifles taped together, a shotgun and a pistol, he exchanged gunfire with police before walking inside and taking his own life. Inside his burned home, investigators found military gear, a gun safe left open, and remnants of his childhood, including a baseball trophy from 1995. The contrast between the boy he once was and the man he became left the community stunned. The mayor had coached McClendon in t-ball. Neighbors remembered him as quiet but not threatening, yet something had clearly snapped. At a prayer service in Sampson, Reverend Steve Sellers addressed the grief without offering explanations. "Father, there are times in life when we don't have answers to the question why," he said. "I don't know what set a young man off like that, but I too want to pray for his family." Michael McClendon's rampage lasted less than an hour, but left behind 20 miles of terror-shattered families in a town forever changed. Among the dead were the very people who might have helped explain what drove him to kill his mother, his grandmother, his uncle, and his cousins. Sometimes the answers die with the gunman. Andrew Reed. Reed Lackey was 22 years old when he committed a crime that would haunt the quiet town of Athens, Alabama. A former eBay trader with no prior criminal record, Lackey lived alone in Huntsville, occasionally visited by his brother. To neighbors and police, he seemed polite, even friendly. But beneath that surface was a young man unraveling, desperate, isolated, and increasingly obsessed with a fantasy of wealth. Lackey had been close friends with Derek Newman since the 4th grade. Derek's grandfather, Charles Newman, was an 80-year-old World War II veteran and retired building contractor. Estranged from his family, Charles lived alone in a stately brick home on North Hines Street. According to trial testimony, Derek once told Lackey that his grandfather was wealthy, a multi-millionaire, and kept gold bars in a hidden vault beneath the stairwell. Whether it was a joke or a careless exaggeration, the idea took root in Lackey's mind. On Halloween night in 2005, Lackey arrived at Charles Newman's home. He carried a stun gun, two pistols, a knife, duct tape, night vision goggles, and a pizza delivery bag, a disguise he had planned months in advance. Inside his rental car, investigators later found a chilling inventory of tools and weapons, along with a police scanner and a utility belt. Lackey had even searched Newman's address online and exchanged messages under the alias Jacob McDeal, describing his plan to rob an old rich guy. Charles Newman managed to dial 911. On the recording, his voice was calm but pleading. "You don't have to do this." Lackey, agitated, demanded, "Where's the vault?" What followed was a brutal confrontation. Newman was stabbed dozens of times, shot with his own revolver, and left to die in his den. Lackey himself was wounded a bullet to the chest and fled the scene, driving toward Huntsville in search of medical help. He was arrested at a Chevron station after asking for an ambulance. Blood covered his clothes, his rental car, and the weapons inside. Forensic evidence later confirmed his DNA on the knife, the revolver, and the boots he wore. Newman's blood was found on Lackey's jeans, his sweatshirt, and the soles of his shoes. The tip of the murder weapon was lodged in Newman's skull. At trial in 2008, Lackey did not testify. He showed little emotion except when his mother spoke of his childhood and his struggles to connect with others. A psychologist described him as sane but autistic with signs of emotional detachment. The jury took just 2.5 hours to convict him on all counts and unanimously recommended the death penalty. In the years that followed, Lackey's legal team, including members of the Equal Justice Initiative, argued that he was mentally ill and should not be allowed to waive his appeals. But Lackey was resolute. He wrote to the Alabama Supreme Court saying, "I do not wish to pursue any further appeals for my death sentence." He fired his attorneys, represented himself, and asked for an execution date. The courts found him competent to make that decision. On July 25, 2013, Andrew Reed Lackey was executed by lethal injection at Holman Prison. He declined to make a final statement. His family watched in silence. The chaplain held his hand and prayed. Lackey closed his eyes and took several deep breaths before the curtain was drawn. In one of his final letters, Lackey wrote, "I am neither crazy nor suicidal nor mentally unstable. But the question remains, what drives a young man to trade his life for a vault that never existed?" Bruce Mendenhal was a long-haul truck driver from Albion, Illinois, a man with no criminal record, a quiet family life, and a chilling secret. At 56 years old, he was arrested for the murder of Sarah Holbert, a 25-year-old woman found dead at a Nashville truck stop. But Sarah's death was only the beginning. What followed was a multi-state investigation that linked Mendenhal to at least 7 women and possibly more. He lived in a modest home with his wife Linda, who was reportedly blind from diabetes, and their 2 adult daughters. Neighbors described him as distant, even cold. He rarely spoke, ignored friendly gestures, and kept to himself. Yet no one suspected that the man behind the wheel of a yellow tractor trailer was hiding a trail of blood that stretched across Tennessee, Indiana, Alabama, and Georgia. Mendenhal's victims were mostly young women involved in sex work. Police believe he targeted them at truck stops, often shooting them and disposing of their bodies in trash bins or remote areas. His methods varied, as some were shot, others run over, and at least one was mutilated. During questioning, Mendenhal confessed to killing Sarah Holbert, Samantha Winters, Lucille Carter, and Karma Purpura. He also admitted to murdering an unidentified woman in Indianapolis, though her body was never found. Detective Pat Pastiglione broke the case. On July 12, 2007, he spotted Mendenhal's truck at a Nashville truck stop and noticed blood on the door. Inside the cab, he found a plastic bag filled with wet blood. When asked about it, Mendenhal claimed he had cut his leg, but there was no wound. He then admitted the blood came from a prostitute in Indianapolis. Police cataloged over 300 items from the truck, including weapons, latex gloves, handcuffs, and sex toys. DNA tests linked the blood to multiple victims. Mendenhal described how the women were killed, some with a plastic bag placed over their heads, secured with black electrical tape, then shot. He even mentioned a tattoo on one victim, saying she had a good tattoo. Investigators later found evidence that a tattoo had been cut from a body. Despite his initial cooperation, Mendenhal later tried to shift blame, naming 2 associates and claiming they used his gun. But police found no evidence of other perpetrators. He eventually asked for an attorney and stopped talking. While in jail, Mendenhal's wife passed away. He received insurance money and attempted to hire fellow inmates to kill 3 witnesses and 2 detectives, including Postiglione. One of the planned murders was meant to mimic his own crimes, a copycat killing, to suggest the real killer was still free. He was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to 30 years. His daughter, Bryna Mendenhal, defended him publicly, saying her father ignored prostitutes and never spoke ill of them. But the evidence told a different story, one of obsession, control, and hidden violence. Bruce Mendenhal remains in custody, charged with multiple murders and suspected in several more. His case is a haunting reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it drives quietly down the highway, waving at no one. Evan Miller was 14 years old when he committed a crime that would change the course of juvenile justice in America. At the time, he lived in a trailer park in Alabama, surrounded by poverty, instability, and neglect. His upbringing was marked by trauma, multiple suicide attempts, foster care placements, and a revolving door of psychological evaluations. Evan's mother, Susan Miller, described him as a troubled child who had been in and out of mental health programs. Teachers and counselors noted signs of manipulation, emotional volatility, and antisocial behavior. Despite his young age, Evan had already developed a dependency on drugs and alcohol, and his home life offered little structure or support. On the night of July 15, 2003, Evan and his 16-year-old friend, Colby Smith, were hanging out at Evan's trailer when their neighbor, Cole Cannon, came over. Cole was 52 years old, visibly intoxicated and looking for something to eat. While Evan's mother prepared spaghetti for him, the boys snuck into Cole's trailer and stole a handful of baseball cards. Cole had only lived in the park for about 3 weeks, but he had a long-standing passion for collecting cards and had once owned a shop dedicated to them. Later that night, Evan and Colby returned to Cole's trailer. They drank beer, smoked marijuana, and played drinking games until Cole passed out on the couch. While he was unconscious, Evan stole his wallet and split the money with Colby, a little over $300. But when Evan tried to return the wallet, Cole suddenly woke up and grabbed him by the throat. What followed was a brutal escalation. Colby struck Cole with a baseball bat. Evan then climbed on top of him and punched him repeatedly. At one point, Evan placed a sheet over Cole's head and said, "I am God. I've come to take your life." He then picked up the bat and continued the assault. After the beating, the boys attempted to clean up the blood and set multiple fires throughout the trailer to cover their tracks. There were at least 4 points of origin, including a couch, a bedroom, and a cushion placed on the floor. As they left, Cole was still alive, coughing and asking, "Why are y'all doing this to me?" Colby, feeling remorse, placed a towel under Cole's head and tried to stop the bleeding. He even turned on the kitchen faucet, hoping the water would extinguish the flames. Firefighters arrived early the next morning. They found blood spatter on the walls, coffee table, and furniture. Cole's body was discovered in the hallway. Initially, the cause of death was ruled as smoke inhalation. But after further investigation and a full autopsy, it was revealed that Cole had suffered multiple rib fractures and blunt force trauma to the head injuries sustained before the fire. Evan was arrested and eventually confessed after giving conflicting statements. He admitted to being under the influence of Klonopin and whiskey at the time of the crime. DNA evidence confirmed Cole's blood on several items, and Evan's own shirt showed blood spatter consistent with physical assault. In 2006, Evan was convicted of capital murder during the course of first-degree arson. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Colby Smith accepted a plea deal and received a life sentence with the possibility of parole. The case sparked national debate. In 2012, Evan's appeal reached the United States Supreme Court in Miller v. Alabama, challenging the constitutionality of life without parole for juveniles. The ruling would later reshape sentencing laws across the country. But for Cole Cannon's family, no legal victory could undo the pain. His daughter Candy Cheatham spoke at sentencing, showing Evan photos of her father as a child salvaged from the ashes. She said he was a person, he mattered to us, and he was murdered by a 14-year-old who said he was God. Evan Miller's story is not just about a crime. It's about a system, a childhood lost, and a question that still haunts the justice system. How do we hold children accountable for adult acts of violence? Atlanta, summer of '96, the world gathered for the Olympic Games celebrating unity and peace. But in the early hours of July 27th, a bomb exploded in Centennial Olympic Park. One woman was killed. Over 100 were injured. The attack wasn't carried out by a foreign terrorist group. It was the work of a lone American extremist, Eric Robert Rudolph, a man driven by ideology, resentment, and a warped sense of justice. This is the story of how one man turned a global celebration into a battlefield and how he evaded capture for 5 years. Born in 1906, Rudolph grew up in Florida and later North Carolina. After his father died, he was raised by a survivalist mother who distrusted modern society. At 18, she took him to a compound linked to the Christian identity movement, a white supremacist sect. Rudolph later denied religious motives, calling himself Catholic, but his writings revealed contradictions. Admiration for Nietzsche, disdain for organized religion, and a fixation on purity and control. These early influences laid the foundation for a violent ideology that would later explode into action. Between 1996 and 1998, Rudolph carried out 4 bombings. His targets: an abortion clinic, a gay nightclub, and the Olympic Games. He used dynamite packed with nails to maximize injury. In Birmingham, a police officer was killed. A nurse was maimed. In Atlanta, over 100 were wounded. Rudolph claimed his motive was political, to shame the U.S. government for allowing abortion and to disrupt the Olympics, which he saw as promoting global socialism. But his plan failed. The games continued, and the nation began hunting him. After the Birmingham bombing, Rudolph vanished into the Appalachian wilderness. The FBI placed him on its 10 most wanted list, offering a $1 million reward. For 5 years, he lived off the grid, possibly aided by sympathizers. Locals sold T-shirts that read, "Run, Rudolph, run." Country songs praised him. Meanwhile, his brother Daniel made headlines by cutting off his own hand in protest. And an innocent man, Richard Jewell, was wrongly accused of a mistake that haunted investigators. Rudolph became a myth. But myths don't last forever. On May 31, 2003, a rookie officer spotted Rudolph scavenging behind a grocery store in Murphy, North Carolina. He was clean-shaven, calm, and unarmed. His arrest shocked the nation. To avoid the death penalty, Rudolph agreed to plead guilty and reveal the location of 250 pounds of hidden explosives. In court, he showed no remorse. He called the plea deal a tactical choice, denying the government's moral authority to judge him. His words were cold, calculated, a final act of defiance from a man who believed he'd won. In court, victims and families confronted Rudolph. They called him a coward, a small man with a big bomb. A video tribute honored Alice Hawthorne, killed at the Olympics. Her husband said, "Today Alice can rest. Justice is finally served." Rudolph received 4 consecutive life sentences plus 120 years. No parole, no leniency. He was sent to ADX Florence, the most secure federal prison in America, home to the Unabomber, the shoe bomber, and Oklahoma City conspirators. Rudolph would spend 22 hours a day in a concrete cell, alone. Even in prison, Rudolph's voice wasn't silenced. His essays, published by anti-abortion extremists, praised violence and condemned LGBTQ+ communities. Survivors called it harassment, but the law was clear: inmates retained free speech rights. "They want to save my soul," Rudolph wrote mocking religious outreach. "But I prefer Nietzsche to the Bible." His words revealed a man still committed to his ideology, still dangerous, still reaching beyond the prison walls. A reminder that extremism doesn't die with conviction, it adapts, survives, and waits. Eric Rudolph wasn't insane. He was methodical, ideological, and supported by a network of believers. His actions weren't random. They were calculated, designed to terrorize, to punish, to provoke. He claimed faith, but weaponized it. He claimed justice, but delivered pain. Rudolph is a warning that domestic extremism can grow quietly in rural towns, in fringe churches, in the shadows of everyday life. And when it erupts, it leaves scars that last far beyond the blast. On May 27, 2010, Thomas Warren Wizenhand lay strapped to a gurney inside Alabama's Holman prison. He wore white. He said nothing. As the lethal drugs began to flow, his eyes closed, his mouth fell slightly open, and his chest stopped moving. He died quietly, far more gently than the women he had slaughtered. But to understand Wizenhand, we must return to Clark Street in Pritchard, Alabama, the house where he was born, raised, and broken. His mother, Emma, ruled the home with iron rage. His father, Willie, was a meek alcoholic who washed dishes and absorbed beatings. From infancy until age 7, Thomas slept in the same bed as his mother. Until age 16, he shared her bedroom. She controlled his money, his movements, his mind. She never let him go. Psychiatrists later testified that every woman Wizenhand killed was a symbolic stand-in for his mother, a mother substitute he annihilated to preserve his own fractured identity. And he didn't just kill, he mutilated. Cheryl Lynn Payton was 24 years old, a convenience store clerk, a mother of two. On October 16, 1976, Wizenhand abducted her, raped her in the front seat of his pickup truck, and shot her once in the head. He left her body in a field. But 2 days later, he returned not to hide the crime, but to desecrate her. He sliced off part of her breast, cut her abdomen, and left her lying in the woods. Her hand still clutched a tuft of grass, a phenomenon known as cadaveric spasm, often seen in traumatic gunshot deaths. He was spotted near the scene and fled in his truck, leading police on a high-speed chase reaching 100 miles per hour. When cornered, he shouted to his wife through a loudspeaker, "Baby, I have done everything they said I did." He was arrested without resistance. In custody, Wizenhand confessed to killing two other women, Venora Hyatt and Patricia Hitt, both convenience store clerks, both murdered in silence. He admitted to mutilating their bodies. He admitted to beating a woman during his time in the Air Force. And his defense attorney told the jury that at age 13, Wizenhand had shot and killed a 70-year-old woman. The bullet had been marked with an X. He had said, "This bullet is going to kill somebody." Psychiatrists debated his sanity for decades. One declared him temporarily insane during the killings. Others said he was fully aware, fully responsible. All agreed his childhood was grotesquely abnormal, but prosecutors argued many people grow up poor with alcoholic parents and controlling mothers, they don't become serial killers. Wizenhand spent 32 years, 8 months, and 26 days on death row, longer than any inmate in Alabama history. He read the Bible, he smoked menthols, he sliced up Playboy magazine photos the same way he had sliced his victims. When he died, Cheryl Payton's family said he showed no remorse. He died too easily. But maybe for a man like Thomas Warren Wizenhand, a man raised in isolation, warped by domination, and consumed by compulsion, death wasn't mercy. It was the final silence, the end of a cycle that began in a white-framed house on Clark Street and ended in a concrete room behind green curtains.